Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over...
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So ladies, I'm going to go over... Okay. Ladies. So, there are 4 questions I want to look at, okay? And they're not going to be in this order. For some reason, this projector has a mind of its own.
Oh, that was my fault. I kind of hit it.
That's okay. We're going to go over... So some of you are very aware, I'm surprised, Carrie, you were so aware there, that I added 2 questions.
Because I did them all 3 hours break, thinking I had to do them and get them in, and then come back and if you didn't get it.
Wow, a lot of rage there, a lot of anger. Okay, we're going to go over adaptive radiation. We're going to compare convergent and divergent evolution. These ones will take very little time. And then we'll talk about endosymbiosis and something called coevolution. But I'm going to go actually in reverse order. I'm going to go over these 2 first, okay? So, all you need to know are the answers to those 4 questions. So we're going to talk about endosymbiosis first. One of the questions is, what is it? Okay? Now, does anyone in biology difference endo and ecto?
Yeah, in and out.
Yeah, one refers to inside, the other one refers to outside. Which one's which? Yeah. So, endo means inside, ecto is outside. So like an ectoparasite would be a parasite that's external. Something that's endo, anything with the word endo or the prefix endo means inside, okay? What does symbiosis mean? You ever heard of that term? Means to, work together in some way. Now, might not necessarily be good, but to work together in some way, okay? So, endosymbiosis refers to organisms working together, but one organism is inside another organism. Now, this is something that you should be very familiar with because you have a lot of endosymbionts living inside you. So the bacteria that live inside you that are beneficial, those are examples of endosymbionts, okay? Now there's the nasty bacteria that want to get inside, okay, but they're not there to help you out. So an endosymbiont is something that works with another organism, but it's internal, okay? Now the reason why I'm bringing this up is we've talked about how evolution works, right? You know the basic idea. You know it's basically you start with a population. They have to have variety, and then over time there's like a selective pressure that favors certain things over others, and over time you can change, right? But sometimes what happens is we can't really explain all of the changes just using that very simple idea. Okay? Sometimes other things you have to use another explanation to explain something that is a bit more complicated than that idea of variation, selection, and time. Like, for example, if you look at the eukaryotic cell, right? You guys studied that in grade 9. So you guys study like the organelles of a cell. So you remember things like the nucleus and the Golgi bodies and the mitochondria and the chloroplast? It was. It was a while ago. Now, we're going to talk about 2 organelles specifically that would not have arisen through the simple variation, selection, and time. They would have arisen a different way through this process, which is called endosymbiosis. Okay. Basically, what happens is a pretty simple idea. One cell swallows up another cell, but not for the purpose of eating it. Okay. For some other reason. But definitely not to eat it up. So what happens is, in this picture you have a host cell, which is this one over here. Okay, so here's your host cell. It swallows up another cell. Now normally we think of it, if something swallows something else, it's probably going to swallow to eat it. And that happens probably most of the time. But here, something interesting happened. This is a bacteria. It's called an aerobic bacteria. That means it loves what? It loves aerobics. That's very good, guys. Miss McCormick would be very proud. Right, it likes oxygen, and it uses oxygen to make energy, okay? This aerobic bacteria has figured out a trick. It figured out the ability to use oxygen to make a lot of energy. So I like to think of it as like the battery. Now, you guys know, if I were to ask you a question, what is the organelle that provides the cell most of its energy? What would it be? Mitochondria, right? So the question is, where do the mitochondria come from? It's very hard to explain the mitochondria using just simple variation selection in time. Very difficult to do that. But here's a different explanation. Mitochondria actually arose from a different living organism. That different living organism was swallowed up, began to reside inside the host cell, and over time evolved to become the mitochondria. Now you may think, okay, what's this guy on today? Right? Like, what do you mean? You mean the mitochondria used to be something else, something like was living on its own? Now, it sounds like a wacky idea, but there are a few things that actually, when you think of it, makes a lot of sense. The mitochondria, I don't know if you've ever seen what the mitochondria looks like. It actually has two membranes. It has an outer membrane and it has an inner membrane. So if you were to look at a mitochondria, it actually looks like this. There's an outer membrane and there's an inner membrane. And whenever a cell swallows up another cell, it puts another membrane around what it swallows. So whatever it swallows would actually have two membranes. But that's not really the most convincing evidence. What's the most convincing evidence is, and we study this in genetics, what other organelle in your cell has its own DNA? What's the only other, if I were to say to you, where's your DNA? What would you tell me it is?
My fingerprint.
In the nucleus, right? It's in the nucleus. But there is another organelle that has DNA in it. Guys, we're talking about it. It's the mitochondria, okay? Well, I'm referring to the mitochondria. That's what I'm referring to. Okay. So the mitochondria, was that confusing the way I said it? Okay. Okay, sorry. The other organelle that has DNA is the mitochondria. Now the question is, why does it have DNA in it? The only explanation is that actually if you sequence the DNA from the mitochondria, you know how you guys doing your NCBI blast stuff? If you would take the DNA sequence from the mitochondria, it lines up with bacteria. The reason why it lines up with bacteria is because it was a free-living bacterium. Now, the story is actually the same story for the chloroplast. The chloroplast is an organelle that makes what? What does it do? Where do we find chloroplast? Plants. What does it do? It uses sunlight energy and makes what? It uses photosynthesis to make food. Well, a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen. You're right. Guess what the chloroplast also has? Its own DNA. It has its own genome. So the chloroplast also evolved through endosymbiosis. Not just your simple Darwinian, variation selection time. It actually was swallowed up by a host cell and then evolved to become the chloroplast. There's an interesting question. Why? Because right now, if you take the mitochondria out, okay, if you take the mitochondria out of the cell, will it be able to exist on its own? No, right? Because for the cell to work, all the parts have to work together, right? If you take the mitochondria out or a chloroplast out, it doesn't work anymore. But it used to work. It used to be its own living organism. Why doesn't it live, why can't it live on its own anymore? But why? Why? It actually evolved to lose things. What does that remind you of? What does that remind you of? When something is no longer needed, it gets lost. Right, we talked about losing a lot of genes for smell, the dodo bird losing its wings. Here's the thing. The mitochondria is living inside another cell, right? It does not need to do all of the things it used to do because now the whole cell is doing a lot of the things for that organelle. So if genes are no longer needed, what happens to them? What could happen to them?
They die.
Right. Here's the thing though. If the mitochondria loses these valuable genes, can it now survive outside the whole cell? The answer is no. Okay? It can't. And the same thing is true for the chloroplast. So endosymbiosis is just an explanation to explain things like, complicated things like chloroplast, the mitochondria. Even the nucleus actually evolved through endosymbiosis. Okay? So that's one topic. The other one was, I'll come back to, I'll go with these. Because we talked about this already. What do you think is meant by divergent versus convergent evolution?
Divergent is another different reaction.
So divergent means to make things different. You're very, very, very good. Convergent would be the opposite. How do you make things different? We know how the basic idea of Darwinian evolution works. We know it's variation, selection, time. We know sometimes it's not as simple as that. We need to talk about things like endosymbiosis. But the basic mechanism, we've talked about how it works, right? But how do you make things different, though? Right, you need to have one more thing, which is isolation. So in this picture here, what's going on with these crustaceans would be physically separated. They're like really far apart from each other. In fact, maybe this one over here can't even get together with this one because they're not only separated by distance, but also by a land barrier. We know that when we put isolation in, things become more different. What do you think is meant by convergent evolution then?
Putting them all more similar.
Yeah, making things more similar. So, what would be, like for example, these organisms, we've talked about this already, they don't even live close to each other. So there's no way they're going to meet up. But they look similar. Well, no, okay. You could say that, but the problem is when all the continents were together, like mammals wouldn't have been around at that point. And they're all mammals. Right? So they would have evolved after the continent split. Well, why do they look like each other?
Common ancestor.
So there's two reasons why things look like each other. Either it's because of common ancestor, or it's because they evolved to look like each other, and that's what convergent evolution means. Okay, so here's the thing. If you have a situation where there's a certain selection pressure that favors something, let's say the environment favors, in this case, there's a lot of ants, and if you have the ability to eat ants, that gives you a major advantage, right? There's only so many ways you can build an anteater, just like there's only so many ways you can build something that flies, just like there's only so many ways you can build things that can move. Eventually what happens is evolution may come across the same solution multiple times. When things evolve things to look like something else, but it's independent, that's convergent evolution. Okay? Remember the example with the whale and the shark? Okay. We know that whales are mammals, and mammals have limbs, so why does a whale look like a shark? Because to live successfully in the water, to move quickly in the water, you have to have a certain shape, right? So when things look like each other, it's either because they have common ancestry, and that's why they look like each other, or they evolved to look like each other, but that's just a coincidence. Okay? So that's always tricky. Right? I think we talked about like thorns and spines. They look like the same thing, but they came from different parts of the plant. Okay. All right. So if you have a creature that's an albino, let's say you have an albino rat and an albino bear. Was there a common albino rat bear? No. I mean, they would have independently evolved albinism, right? Okay. Okay, coevolution. So we're just going through those 4 questions, all right? What do you think is meant by, we've talked about this. What do you think is meant by coevolution? Yeah, Serena? Right. So we often think about evolution in terms of like adapting to the environment, but the environment includes other living things, right? So when one organism evolves in response to another, that's coevolution. Like, flowers and pollinators are a really neat example. And I'm going to show you one right here. So this is my favorite example of coevolution. This is a bee orchid. Okay? This is a flower that has evolved to look like a bee.
Wait, that's an actual bee?
I know. Weird, right?
Okay.
Now, what happened here? In this situation, this is a very interesting, very complicated situation. This bee orchid not only kind of looks like a bee, but also can produce a scent. Okay? And the scent that it produces, when a male bee is flying around, the scent that it produces is of a female bee that wants to play chess. Go for coffee. I'm not going to spell it out for you guys.
Oh.
I say spell it out. I mean spell it out, or spill the bean. So the male bee is flying around and it looks like that looks like a female bee. Oh, it smells like a female bee. Oh, it smells like a female bee that wants to play chess. I'm going to go investigate. Okay. Now, well, why do bees and other pollinators visit flowers? There's a reward, right? For the pollinator. What's the reward for the pollinator? No, they pick up something. But that's not a reward for the pollinator. That's the reward for the plants, right? Right. So often they'll get honey. In this case, the reward actually, from what I read, the male bee gets some practice.
Oh my god.
So that when he comes across the actual, that's what I read. It sounds a little funny, but that's what I read. But here's the thing. This bee orchid evolved to look like a bee. It evolved not because it wanted to evolve, but obviously there was an advantage to looking like a male bee, or like female bee. And obviously this is in response to in an environment full of bees, right? So when one organism evolves in response to another organism, it's called coevolution. Oh, by the way, what's interesting, when there's no more pollen, this orchid could switch its scent to a female that has already mated and does not want to be bothered anymore. Okay? Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting. Here's another example. This is a newt. Okay? It's an amphibian, and it's highly toxic. Now, the garter snake has evolved resistance to this newt. So, what happened over evolutionary time is you have these newts. Some are slightly more poisonous than others. And then you have garter snakes. Some are slightly more resistant than others. Right? The ones that are more poisonous have an advantage. And then over time, what you're left with are more poisonous newts. But then what happens is the garter snakes, the ones that have more resistance, that can eat the more poisonous newts, have an advantage. So over evolution of time, you get very poisonous newts, and you get very resistant garter snakes. That reminds me of the cheetah and the gazelle, right? The exact same story. Here's another one. So there is a parasite, this one here. And there's many examples of coevolution, but here's another one. So there's a parasite, here's its name, Plasmodium, I think it's Rickenaui. I just abbreviated it as PR. Has the ability to initially infect chimpanzees, but not humans. Now we know that we're related to chimpanzees, right? Okay.
We are?
Yep. We talked about this.
Are we carriers?
The parasite so what it wants to do is it wants to get into your red blood cells. In malaria, parasite gets in the red blood cells and it destroys them. Okay, and we talked about the advantage of sickle cell, being heterozygous, and being resistant to malaria. That's a neat example of coevolution, right? Neat example. We evolved this high frequency of sickle cell trait in malarial zone. Here is another thing that's related to malaria. The parasite uses this protein called CMAH. Now, the protein in chimps comes from the CMAH gene, and it works. But about 2 million years ago, that protein in humans was destroyed. It became a pseudogene, a dead gene. So now what happened is, any human who had 2 copies, you need to have 2 copies, because if you only have 1 copy, that means half of your CMAH proteins are actually there. But if you have 2 bad copies of CMAH, then you don't make the protein. Here's the thing. The parasite needs that protein to get into the cells. So if you don't make that protein, you have a major advantage. You can't get the disease. So guess what happened? Anyone who had that protein, anyone who didn't make the protein, survived, had kids, or was more likely to survive and have kids. Here's an interesting bit. After that, the parasite evolved the ability to attack a different protein. It had a mutation in one of its genes called EBA175 that allowed it then to go after a different protein. So this is like the neat example of where one thing evolves something. Now you probably see this in history, right? Like you get like 2 countries that want to fight. So one will raise an army, then the other one will raise a bigger army. Then one will start collecting all of these guns and weapons. And you see it today, right? Like, the North Korea says something, and then the States will come back, and then you get this escalation. And this is the coevolution is exactly the same story. Okay, we're almost done. One last topic. Adaptive radiation. Now, we've actually talked about this before. So this has to do with a new environment opening up. Now, remember with the innerfish? Remember mammals in the time of dinosaurs were living where? Underground. And then what happened to the dinosaurs? By what? The asteroid? So a new environment opened up because the old environment was altered. And then mammals came out from the ground and they started to multiply and diversify. So this adaptive radiation just simply means when a new environment opens up or changes dramatically, then you get this like explosion of diversity. And for me, this reminds me of, again, I'm using the analogy of the internet. Like the internet is a needed analogy for this because the internet was a new environment. And think about all of the things that have come out since the internet evolved, right? It's the exact same parallel. A new environment opens up, if all these new opportunities, and then you get this explosion of different forms. Just like if a new set of islands pop up from under the ocean, new environment, you get all of these, and this is what you're seeing here, this explosion of different, in this case, different beaks. Okay? So that's what adaptive radiation refers to. All right, ladies? That's it for those questions. So we cover them all. All right? These 4. So now you guys can use the rest of the time to work on your NCBI lab. Unless you have questions. The end.